you Fodor's language of thought hypothesis and how it is motivated on the basis of its ability to explain human action. So, in order to understand the language of thought hypothesis, we have to get a distinction on the table. And this distinction is that between vehicle and content. Okay, so this idea of a mental state has come up before in the earlier lectures. And in this lecture, it's especially important. So again, examples of mental states are things like beliefs, desires, wants, intentions, hopes, etc. And these things, mental states, have what philosophers call content. Okay? Now, when talking about the content of a mental state, this is the same as talking about its meaning. Okay? So just as we can say that a sentence is a vehicle, is a thing that has a certain meaning, which is what we've been talking a lot about in this class so far, we can similarly say that a mental state is a vehicle for its meaning. And just as a convention, instead of talking about the meaning of mental states, philosophers generally talk about the content of mental states. Okay, and philosophers will also talk about the content of sentences, but also at the same time talk about their meaning. But it's important to note that the term content and the term meaning are basically synonymous. Okay, it's just that it's more natural for some reason to use the word content when talking about mental states. Okay, but just to make clear this idea of a vehicle, when in the earlier lectures when we've talked about sentences having meaning, the sentence is a thing which has as a property a kind of meaning, okay? And so what we can say is that the sentence is a kind of vehicle for a meaning, okay? So the sentence is a thing, a string of words, say, or an utterance, okay? The sentence is a container or a vehicle which is able to hold meaning. Okay, so talking about a sentence as a vehicle for meaning is kind of like a metaphor for thinking about how the sentence itself is a thing which has meaning or content. So similarly, when we talk about mental states and wonder about their meaning or their content, as we'll be talking about it as, we can say that a mental state itself is also something that is a vehicle for meaning or content. But now the question arises, how is it that a mental state can be a vehicle for content? How is it that a mental state can be something which has content or which bears content? One thing we could say is that a mental state is a physical state of the brain. So for instance, certain kinds of neurons firing in a certain region. And we could say that this type of physical state, i.e. this certain type of neuron firing, is a physical state that somehow bears a certain representation of the world outside of it, outside of the head of the person whose neurons it is. So that would be one way of making sense of how a mental state can be something as a vehicle for content, by saying that a mental state is really just a physical state of the brain, and this physical state of the brain carries certain information about the external world. However, given the example in the last video about how citing our mere mental state, given the example in the last video about how citing the physical states of our brain does not provide an explanation for our actions, it therefore does not seem plausible to say that mental states just are types of physical states of the brain. What Fodor says instead, in order to make sense of how mental states are vehicles for content, is precisely his language of thought hypothesis, which we can abbreviate as LOT. So this hypothesis is as follows. An individual has a belief or some other mental state with content P, just in case that individual is related to a sentence that has P as its meaning. Okay, so let's put aside other mental states than belief for now, since belief will be the main one that we talk about. And so given that we're focusing just on belief, this hypothesis, again, is that what it means for an individual to have a belief with a certain content P just is for that individual to be related to some sentence that has P as its meaning. Now, it's important that this sentence that the individual is related to is not necessarily a sentence of natural language, for instance, English, or if they're a French speaker, a sentence of French. Rather, what Fodor claims is that there's a certain language of thought, or another word for that is mentalese. Okay? So instead of, for instance, Japanese, a natural language, there's also the language of mentalese, which is the mental language, or the language of human thought. And this language of human thought is very similar to natural language in that it has names and predicates and sentences. And furthermore, according to the LOT hypothesis, what it means to have a belief with a certain content is for you to be related to a sentence in your language of thought, which itself has P, the content P, as its meaning. Okay, so in this class so far, we've talked a lot about how sentences have meanings. Now, in this lecture, we're focusing a lot on how to think about beliefs also having meanings or contents. Now, this language of thought hypothesis actually provides a very simple answer to think about to how belief can have content, given that we understand how sentences can have content. And the simple answer it gives is that what a belief is simply just the grasping of a sentence. And as we know from the background, that sentences do have meanings. And so the belief inherits its content from that of the sentence it involves a relation to. Okay. Now, how is it that this language of thought hypothesis is motivated on the basis of psychological explanation? So it goes as follows. If a mental state is just a relation of a subject to a sentence, and going forward, in order to talk about how a mental state is a relation of a subject to a sentence, we'll talk about this mental state as a subject tokening a sentence. Okay, so this is presupposing the distinction from last lecture between a type and a token. So again, a token sentence is a particular use of a sentence. It's a sentence type that has been used on a particular occasion. Okay, so the idea is that for someone to have a belief, say, involves that person tokening some sentence within their mind, in a sense. Okay, and that's according to the language of thought hypothesis what it means to have a belief. It's to token a sentence inside of your head. Okay, so if the language of thought hypothesis is true, if mental states involve subjects tokening sentences, then, given some ideas from deductive logic, which I'll review in a second, we can easily understand how mental states can both cause and justify other mental states. Okay, so in the first video, we talked about how inference was an important kind of mental action. And what the language of thought hypothesis can do is explain how the action of inference is one that has a suitable psychological explanation, i.e., the language of thought hypothesis can explain how the inferences we make the transitions in our thought that we do, how these are rational, how they're caused and justified by other mental states. We can characterize inference as an internal mechanism by which sentences themselves are manipulated to bring about new sentences. And furthermore, these new sentences will be entailed and hence justified by the earlier sentences. So we can understand inference as involving sentences causing one another internally, and furthermore, there being relations of justification between them. Now, how does this work? In order to see the idea of how this is supposed to work, I want you to consider the following example from deductive logic. So consider the following inference schema, which is called modus ponens. This is an inference schema because it's not a particular inference between particular sentences, but rather shows the form of a whole bunch of possible inferences. So what this inference schema shows us is a certain way of arguing. And this way of arguing or performing inference is one in which there's two premises and a conclusion. The first premise is the conditional if P, then Q. The second premise is the sentence P. And the conclusion is Q. So again, what modus ponens says is that if you have that if P then Q is true, and if you have that P is true, you then infer Q. Okay? And hopefully for most, if not all of you, this is review of basic logic. And what we know from basic logic is that for any particular sentences that we may slot in for P and Q here, regardless of what those particular sentences are, regardless of their meaning, it will be the case that if both these premises are true, then the conclusion must be as well. So this schema of modus ponens, or this form of argument, is such that if you put in any particular sentences with any meaning whatsoever for P and Q, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be. And that's what it means to say that this is a valid type of inference. And note that since these premises guarantee the truth of their conclusion, the premises will justify their conclusion. Okay, these premises provide an adequate basis or reason for accepting the conclusion. So here is an instance of this kind of reasoning. Suppose one morning you make the following inference. The first premise is as follows. You have the belief that if I see dark clouds out my window, then I'll bring my umbrella to work. So that's the first premise, and this is one belief you have. Now the second premise is another belief, which is that you do see dark clouds out your window. Okay, so the idea is that you wake up and you're wondering whether to bring your umbrella to work, and you haven't looked out your window yet, and you think to yourself first, if I see some dark clouds out there, then I'll bring my umbrella. And that's the first kind of premise, or the first kind of belief you have. And the second belief is you gain when you in fact look out the window and you see the dark clouds. And then once you have those two beliefs, you infer the conclusion that you'll bring your umbrella to work. Okay, so this is a kind of chain of reasoning which you engage in. It's a kind of inference that you do. Now, if your beliefs corresponding to premise 1 and premise 2, if, as the language of thought hypothesis says, if these beliefs consist of tokenings of these sentences in your thought, in your language of thought, then there can be an internal mechanism that can identify these as having the form of the first two premises of this inference schema, modus ponens. Okay, so if you have these two sentences, P1 and P2, tokened inside of your language of thought, then there can be an internal mechanism inside of your head which notices that these two sentences have this same syntactic form, or have the syntactic form of the premises of this inference schema. So what this internal mechanism does is it just can look at the actual sentences themselves and notice that this clause right here, the antecedent of the conditional, shows up here in the antecedent of the conditional, and also shows up as a second premise. And so just by looking at the sentences themselves, it can be determined that you have something of the form where you have a sentence P in the antecedent of one premise, and then that same sentence as the other premise. And then what this internal mechanism can do is that it will then look at what the consequent of the conditional is, so what Q is, and then purely on the basis of just identifying the way these sentences themselves look, it can identify that if you make this into the conclusion, then you'll have a conclusion which is guaranteed to be true if the premises are. Because we know that anything of this form is such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be. So here, what we can do to make sense of how your belief that you'll bring the umbrella to work, how that's caused by these beliefs, is simply by an internal mechanism that is able to inspect the form of the sentences of your earlier beliefs. Okay, so because we can make sense of how there's an internal mechanism that's manipulating these sentences, we can make sense of how it is that our beliefs are caused by other beliefs, or we can make sense of how it is that the inferences are, as things we do, are things which are caused by other mental states. And then, furthermore, we have this causal relation in virtue of an internal syntactic mechanism. And just to be clear, the idea of an internal syntactic mechanism is important because the idea goes, the only way that one belief can cause another belief is in virtue of an internal mechanism inside of your own mind. And if this internal mechanism inside your own mind is able to look at these form of these sentences, which are also tokened inside your own mind, then we can make sense of how there can be an internal mechanism that is causing one belief than the other. And then furthermore, because this inference follows a pattern which is valid, which semantically, no matter what these meanings are, if these premises are true, then the conclusion will be true. We also see how this inference here is justified. We also see why your action of making this inference is a justified action. Because it's one in which if the premises of the inference are true, then the conclusion must be. So in this video, I've given you the basic idea behind Fodor's language of thought hypothesis, and I've explained to you how it's motivated on the basis of making sense of the rationality of human action, and specifically human inference as a kind of human action.